After their successful invasion of France, Germany shifted their attention to their former ally, the Soviet Union. On June 22nd, 1941, the Axis forces launched what would be at that time the biggest invasion in history onto the Soviet Union. The Soviet army, being caught off guard, sustained heavy losses, and by August, German forces approached the city of Leningrad. On September 8th, 1941, the city was entirely encircled by the German and Finnish forces. The siege that followed would cause the deaths of an estimated 800,000 civilians. At the beginning of the siege, the city only had enough food and fuel to last for 30 days, and on the 8th of September, German bombers blew up the city's grain and sugar supplies. The city was officially out of food. The only ways that it could be brought in was through airlifting supplies, which was not enough for the 3 million people still in the city. Food rations were introduced, with people only getting 125 grams of bread per day. The city was on the brink of complete starvation and collapse. Yet despite all of this, the city held out. A new defensive strategy utilizing the Baltic Fleet was devised by the Russian general Georgy Zhukov, and the Axis advance was stopped. Following this, an order was given by Adolf Hitler that the city be starved and erased from the earth. Several attempts to relieve the besieged city were thwarted by German forces, and it became clear that the encirclement would last. The saving of the city came from something that would become known as the Road of Life. The Lake of Ladoga remained the only connection between the city and the rest of the country. Winter offered the possibility of a land connection on the frozen lake. On November 20th, the first sleds made their way across the frozen lake. This was the beginning of the Road of Life. Soon trucks were going across the ice. However, they were vulnerable to not only German artillery and air bombardment, but most important was the constant danger of the ice. There was no way to know the thickness of it, and trucks were victims of collapsing ice. The path itself was so deadly that drivers began to refer to it as the Road of Death. Despite this, the road continued operation throughout the winter and was the only thing keeping the city alive. This was a massive demonstration of courage from not only the drivers themselves, but the many soldiers who defended it against incoming air attacks and a potential ground attack. Other than simply being a supply route, it also served as an evacuation route. Throughout the blockade, around 1 million people were evacuated from the city, which included 50,000 wounded soldiers. An oil pipeline was also built underneath the lake, which provided much-needed fuel for the city. Throughout the siege, an incredible amount of courage was shown by the citizens of the city. Despite food and electrical shortages, the city continued to work. The Kirov factory, despite being in the city, continued to produce tanks that were then shipped to the war effort. And the popular composer Shostakovich was flown into the city to premiere his Seventh Symphony in August of 1942. The audio of it was played towards German front lines as a way to show resilience of the city. Everyone in the city was mobilized, with children putting out firebombs while civilians worked to construct a new port for convoys to deliver supplies in the summer. Perhaps one of the greatest examples of such courage was the scientist working in the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry. At the time, it was one of the biggest collections of seeds with great biodiversity. The Vavilov Institute had accumulated seeds from 187,000 varieties of plants, of which 40,000 were food crops. Throughout the siege, the institute suffered from lack of heating, with scientists burning anything they could get their hands on in order to keep the seeds from spoiling. Many of those same scientists starved to death while having access to literal tons of food just to preserve these plants. The blockade was completely lifted on January 27, 1944, 872 days after it started, making it the longest siege of the war. Actions, such as ones listed above, show not only the courage of the citizens of the city, but everyone else who was involved in the operations to keep the city alive. For me, this project has been very important, as some of my ancestors were in the city when the siege occurred, as well as myself originally being from the city of St. Petersburg. We must remember these things, simply because if we do not, they are forgotten. In the year 1946, a year after the war had ended, the Museum of the Siege of Leningrad was shut down and its founders executed on orders by Stalin. And even today, that same institute that scientists died for is at risk of closing due to lack of funding, meaning it cannot afford its electrical bills. We must never forget what the people of Leningrad went through, as it is the least we can do. Thank you.